The morning began with a thunderous knock that felt like judgment, and the hook was instant, undeniable, electric from within. Karen stood on my porch gripping a clipboard like a weapon, claiming half my property in a steady whisper today. Her eyes measured fences, shadows, and history, and she said the oak tree proved the land was hers by destiny. I felt the ground tilt beneath my boots as neighbors watched, and the fear hardened into stubborn, burning resolve inside. She demanded a survey immediately, promising lawyers, trouble, and noise unless I surrendered the disputed strip without argument that day. But every memory of sweat, repairs, and storms shouted that I had guarded this boundary with patience and honesty alone. So I told Karen we would follow facts, not threats, and I called a surveyor who trusted precision over drama. The appointment felt like a fuse, ticking quietly, while rumors spread and fences became battleground lines marked in anxious whispers. At night I walked the yard, replaying childhood summers beneath that oak, promising myself truth would speak louder than fear. Friends warned me Karen rarely lost disputes, yet the more she boasted, the clearer her arrogance uncovered hidden cracks everywhere. She brought folders stuffed with photocopies and maps, but dates clashed, signatures wobbled, and boundaries floated like mirages before us. Still, she smiled for audiences, promising victory, while I prepared quietly, gathering deeds, photographs, and stories from elders nearby farther. The surveyor arrived at dawn with instruments gleaming, and every click sounded like truth carving pathways through fog above us. Karen hovered behind him, narrating ownership claims, yet his measurements ignored ego and followed landmarks older than rumor itself forever. When he paused beside the oak, the wind rose, and I felt the moment tightening like a drum before judgment. He marked a stake far from Karen's imagined border, and silence swept the yard, heavier than any argument that day. The numbers told a different story, revealing forgotten easements and a decades-old correction Karen never bothered to read carefully. My fear melted into steady relief while Karen's confidence cracked, and the triumph I felt burned bright yet patient inside. The survey was not finished, but destiny had shifted, and I knew the truth would soon stand undeniable for all. This was only the beginning of her biggest mistake, and the next steps would expose everything she feared most deeply. I steadied my breath, guarded my boundary, and prepared for consequences that would echo through every corner of town tomorrow. The town waited breathless, because once the final markers were placed, reputations, friendships, and illusions would transform for good tonight. The surveyor continued measuring the yard with a calm precision that clashed with Karen's rising frustration, and every new stake he planted seemed to drain another ounce of certainty from her loud confidence while the neighbors gathered quietly along the fence to witness the unfolding truth. I watched her rehearse arguments under her breath, flipping through documents that suddenly felt flimsy against the weight of lawful markers and recorded deeds, and though she tried to sound fearless, there was a tremor in her voice that betrayed something deeper than simple anger. She insisted the oak tree was the ultimate boundary, yet the surveyor traced older pins buried beneath the soil, artifacts of a correction made decades earlier when two families settled a dispute without noise, lawyers, or spectacle, leaving records Karen had clearly never studied carefully. Her expression shifted from bold to brittle as the survey maps were unfolded across the hood of his truck, lines intersecting, angles sharp as truth, and for the first time since she appeared on my porch, Karen fell silent, forced to stare at evidence that did not bend for ego or reputation. I remembered the years I had invested into this land, rebuilding fences, repairing the shed after storms, planting along the slope, and the idea that someone could simply walk in and claim it with bravado felt insulting, yet now justice spoke in measured numbers instead of arguments. The surveyor pointed to the recorded plat, explained the forgotten easement, and his steady tone treated both of us equally, though the conclusions favored reality, not noise. Karen tried one last surge of control, promising court filings and threats no longer sharpened by certainty, but even her supporters exchanged uneasy glances as the markers formed a story no rumor could erase. I did not gloat, because this land had shaped my patience, and victory meant protecting legacy rather than humiliating a neighbor, Yet I understood that Karen's mistake was no longer a simple misunderstanding, it was an echo of pride carried too far. The afternoon sun deepened shadows along the boundary, and the stakes stood like witnesses ready to speak again if challenged, steady and undeniable. When the surveyor packed his instruments, he said the full report would seal everything beyond question, and I felt relief settle into determination, because I knew Karen would not retreat quietly, and her next move might be louder than the first. I walked the property one more time, tracing the true line, promising myself I would defend it with patience and truth. Even after the surveyor left, the tension lingered across the neighborhood like heat after a storm, and every conversation felt cautious, because people sensed that Karen was planning something larger than denial. I spent the evening organizing my records, reviewing the photographs of repairs I had completed through the years, and writing a calm timeline of ownership so nothing could be twisted or misunderstood. The truth was steady, yet my nerves hummed, because pride rarely retreats quietly, and Karen's pride had become a wall she refused to step down from. The next morning she arrived again, not with threats, but with an unsettling smile, claiming she had discovered a loophole buried inside an old permit that might overturn the survey's findings. Her voice sounded rehearsed, each sentence shaped for drama, and she hinted that a private investigator had uncovered conversations about the original division of the lots. I listened carefully, refusing to argue, and I asked her to share the documents with me directly, promising I would review them with the same patience I expected for my evidence. Instead of offering papers, she delivered stories, thin strands of rumor stretched into certainty, and I realized her mistake was deepening. She was fighting the report with shadows. Word spread that Karen planned a public meeting at the community hall, determined to pressure me into surrendering land that was never hers. I felt anxiety, but I also felt resolve, because fear loses power when truth stands beside you. At the meeting, folding chairs formed a rough circle, and the air carried whispers of history, loyalty, and quiet judgment. Karen spoke first, weaving emotion into every claim, pointing toward the oak outside as if it were a witness summoned to her side. When it was my turn, I opened the survey packet, laid out the maps, and explained each recorded change with respect, not anger. The room shifted. People leaned closer. They saw dates, signatures, and coordinates that no rumor could rewrite. Karen's expression tightened, and I understood the turning point had arrived. Pride had led her to challenge facts, now those same facts pushed back. The hall grew quiet, and in that silence I realized this conflict was no longer about boundaries or fences, but about accountability she had spent years avoiding, and the weight of that realization settled across the room like dust after a long collapse. I held my breath, knowing the truth had finally spoken for itself, and whatever Karen chose to do next would reveal more about her character than any claim she had made against my land. I felt ready for whatever came afterward, steady, watchful, and unafraid. At last. After the meeting ended, the hall emptied slowly, and every step across the wooden floor sounded like a verdict waiting to settle. I carried the survey packet home, grateful for the quiet, yet I knew the conflict was not finished, because Karen's silence never meant surrender. That evening, I received an email from the surveyor stating that the certified report would be filed with the county the following morning, locking every boundary into record and placing our dispute beneath the weight of official history. The message steadied me, but it also warned that Karen had requested copies, which meant another move was coming. The next day she arrived with a printed letter, announcing that she intended to challenge the report through a private appraisal of her own. She spoke with rehearsed certainty, insisting the oak tree still proved her claim, yet her confidence lacked the force it once carried. I answered calmly, explaining that truth did not fear review, and that every lawful question would be met with patience rather than anger. Inside, however, I sensed that her determination was not fueled by evidence, but by the fear of admitting a public mistake. Neighbors began sharing their memories of the earlier boundary correction, stories of handshakes, notarized forms, and a promise to avoid conflict. Their recollections braided together with the surveyor's findings, forming a narrative too consistent to doubt, and with each conversation, my resolve deepened. I did not seek victory, I sought closure, the chance to protect the land I had tended through storms, repairs, and long evenings spent listening to wind in the grass. When the certified report finally arrived, its pages shone with precision, coordinates clean, signatures firm, history woven into measured lines that honored both past and present. I placed it on the kitchen table, and for a moment I simply breathed, grateful that the truth now stood beyond rumor. Then I realized Karen had not yet appeared, and the quiet felt like the calm before another sudden knock. I prepared copies, organized photographs, and waited by the window, ready for whatever story she would bring next, and ready, finally, to let the truth speak for itself. The sun dipped behind the ridge, and shadows stretched across the true boundary, calm and unwavering. I understood that the next choice belonged entirely to Karen, and whatever she decided would reveal whether pride or humility guided her future. I felt no hatred, only caution and resolve, because honesty had already taken root in every corner of the yard. Tomorrow would bring documents, conversations, and consequences none of us could escape, yet I faced them with steady courage and trusted the truth. The certified report settled into the county archive like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples carried through conversations, emails, and quiet glances along the fence line. Karen did not appear that morning, yet I could feel her presence in every rumor that drifted across the neighborhood, each one shaped by uncertainty and fading pride. I spent the day repairing the shed roof, letting ordinary work steady my thoughts, because the land had always answered worry with patience. Late in the afternoon, a car door slammed outside, and Karen finally walked toward my porch holding a thin envelope that trembled slightly in her hand. She said the appraisal she commissioned did not support her claim, and for a moment the words hovered between us like dust in sunlight. Instead of anger, she carried exhaustion, and I realized the fight had cost her more than she would ever admit aloud. She asked to step into the yard, to stand beside the newly marked line, and we walked there in silence while the wind brushed the grass and the survey stakes cast narrow shadows across the ground. Karen confessed that she had relied on a story told by a distant relative, a tale repeated so often it hardened into certainty, and she feared that backing down would make her appear weak. I told her that humility was not weakness, and that truth could mend what pride had fractured if given time. For the first time since the dispute began, she listened without preparing a counterargument. We reviewed the documents together, page by page, and the history unfolded with clarity, the correction, the signatures, the promise to respect the division. Karen nodded slowly, then folded the envelope and slipped it into her jacket, as if she were finally placing the past where it belonged. She apologized, not dramatically, but honestly, and the apology settled on the air like rain after dust. I accepted it, because this land had taught me resilience without bitterness, and I knew that victory meant stewardship rather than triumph. We stood by the oak, two neighbors shaped by different fears, and agreed to repair the fence as partners so the boundary would protect both of our homes. The sun lowered beyond the ridge, and the yard felt peaceful for the first time in weeks, carrying a quiet promise forward with every breath of wind. That evening I walked the boundary once more, listening to the quiet dusk settle over the posts, and I felt the land breathe with relief, reminding me that patience, honesty, and courage had guarded every inch of the truth from the first doubt to the final decision. In the days that followed, the neighborhood slowly returned to routine, yet the memory of the dispute lingered like a faint echo across the yards. The repaired fence stood straight and bright, a quiet monument to patience, and every time I walked past it I felt gratitude instead of anger. Karen kept her distance at first, learning to move carefully within the boundaries she once tried to erase, and I hoped the calm would last. But peace often reveals truths that conflict hides. One afternoon the surveyor called again, explaining that while finalizing the filing he uncovered an overlooked parcel note connected to the abandoned drainage path behind our lots. The discovery did not threaten my land, yet it exposed how fragile records had become over the years, and it reminded me that stewardship required constant attention. I met him at the back ridge, and together we traced the old ditch line through weeds and scattered stones, reading history in the shape of the ground. Karen joined us quietly, no clipboard, no speeches, only curiosity. She listened as the surveyor described how earlier owners had rerouted water without updating plans, a mistake smaller than our conflict yet rooted in the same neglect of detail. For a moment we stood as collaborators instead of adversaries, guardians of a shared landscape that needed understanding more than victory. I realized her greatest mistake had not been the claim itself, but the belief that pride could replace knowledge. We agreed to restore the forgotten path, plant new grass, and record every step so future neighbors would inherit clarity rather than confusion. Working side by side felt strange at first, yet with each shovel of soil the tension thinned, and the land seemed to breathe easier. The oak tree cast wide shade across us, no longer a symbol of argument, but of endurance. That evening I wrote a final entry in my file, not about boundaries, but about gratitude. The survey had uncovered more than markers, it revealed character, resilience, and the quiet strength of truth. I understood that ownership is not measured only in lines on a map, but in the care we give the spaces that shape our lives. As night settled over the ridge, I walked the boundary one last time, hearing crickets rise from the grass and the steady rustle of leaves above the oak, and I felt a deeper peace than victory, a sense that every hardship had carried a lesson forward, reminding me that truth, when tended carefully, becomes a shelter wide enough for neighbors, memory, and change. I knew the story of this land would guide us gently in future seasons ahead. Weeks passed, and the quiet victory settled into the rhythm of daily life. The survey stakes remained, markers of truth, while the repaired fence shone in the sun, a reminder that boundaries are more than lines, they are lessons written into the land. Karen and I began to speak with a cautious civility, discussing shared concerns about overhanging trees, water flow, and maintenance schedules. The conflict that had once threatened to erupt into legal battles now became a bridge for dialogue, if not friendship. One morning, I noticed Karen working near the old drainage ditch, digging carefully with determination rather than confrontation. I joined her, and together we cleared debris, mapped the path, and planned small repairs to prevent flooding. As we worked, she admitted the experience had humbled her, and that she had never fully appreciated the time, labor, and love I had invested into the property. I nodded, understanding that pride can blind even the cleverest minds, and that mistakes are often lessons disguised as obstacles. Neighbors began stopping by, commenting on the restored fence, the cleared drainage, and the oak tree that now stood in quiet dignity. Some whispered about the original dispute, amazed at the transformation from conflict to collaboration. I realized then that Karen's biggest mistake had become a gift, teaching both of us and the neighborhood that patience, persistence, and honesty are far more powerful than threats or arrogance. Yet even in this calm, I remained watchful. Property disputes rarely vanish completely, and lessons must be reinforced with action. Each day, I reviewed deeds, photographs, and notes, not out of distrust, but out of respect for the work it took to reach clarity. Karen, too, approached the land differently, asking questions instead of making assumptions, observing rather than claiming. The change was subtle but real, like the first shoots of spring beneath the oak. By the time the sun dipped low on the horizon, the yard was neat, orderly, and strong. Karen and I paused to look at the boundary line together, realizing the property now belonged not to ego or argument, but to care and diligence. There was no applause, no celebration, only the quiet acknowledgement of what had been earned. I felt a sense of completion that reached deeper than the survey markers or legal filings. It was a victory of truth, patience, and perspective, something permanent that could never be undone by rumor or mistake. I turned homeward, glancing once more at the oak, the fence, and the cleared drainage line, knowing the story had changed us both. This land would remain protected, not by fear, but by respect and responsibility. The future seemed steady, grounded, and fair, and the lessons we had learned would guide every step. The days that followed felt almost ordinary, yet beneath the surface, the neighborhood carried a quiet awareness of the transformation that had taken place. People smiled differently when passing by the fence, and even casual conversations hinted at respect rather than speculation. Karen and I maintained a careful distance, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement that the property lines were no longer points of contention, they were markers of patience, law, and truth. The survey stakes glinted in the sun like small monuments, and the oak tree, once a symbol of dispute, now stood as a sentinel, shading the lessons we had learned into the ground beneath it. One evening, a letter arrived from a lawyer representing Karen's distant relatives, claiming a historical interest in a small parcel adjoining my property. My first instinct was tension, remembering the storm of conflict that had already swept through these boundaries. Yet, I felt steadier than ever. I laid the letter on my desk, reviewed it carefully, and traced every reference to deeds, maps, and recorded corrections. Nothing suggested that my land was in jeopardy, it was merely a reminder of how thoroughly knowledge, diligence, and patience guard property far better than fear or anger ever could. I invited Karen to review the documents with me, not as adversaries, but as co-stewards of clarity. She agreed, showing no prideful hesitation, only curiosity and respect. Together, we mapped the references, verified records, and annotated discrepancies. The process reminded both of us how easily assumptions could grow into disputes, and how diligence could prevent mistakes before they escalated into conflict. Karen admitted that her insistence on half the property had blinded her to facts that were always visible, and that her arrogance had been her own undoing. I nodded, recognizing that acknowledgement was more valuable than triumph. By the time the sun touched the ridge, we had traced every line, every note, every parcel reference, and concluded that my ownership remained secure. Karen expressed genuine relief, a quiet humility settling over her face as the wind brushed the grass. We shook hands, not for ceremony, but as acknowledgement that lessons had been learned, pride tempered, and truths protected. The oak cast long shadows across the yard, a reminder that disputes fade but lessons endure. I walked the boundary, feeling a sense of permanence and trust that had been absent before. This land was now shielded not only by law, but by the clarity of shared understanding. Conflicts could arise again, yet I knew that patience, diligence, and honesty had woven a safeguard stronger than fear or confrontation. The morning after our last review felt unusually still, as if the land itself was exhaling relief. The fence stood straight, the stakes marked every corner, and the oak tree cast its familiar shade across the yard, quiet but resolute. I walked along the boundary line, each step measured, grounding myself in the rhythm of the property I had protected with patience, diligence, and care. Karen followed at a respectful distance, no documents in hand, no demands, only observation. The tension that had once defined our interactions had dissolved into something far subtler, a recognition that pride could be tempered by truth, and mistakes could become lessons if humility guided their correction. We paused by the oak, watching sunlight scatter through its branches. Karen finally spoke, her voice low and unguarded. She admitted the fight for half the property had been a mistake, driven by misunderstanding and a stubborn refusal to see history clearly. She said she had learned more than she expected, not just about boundaries, but about accountability, patience, and perspective. I nodded, realizing that her greatest lesson mirrored my own, that victory was not in defeating others, but in guarding truth, integrity, and the spaces entrusted to us. Neighbors began to notice the change. Conversations at fences no longer carried whispers of disputes but quiet admiration for how the land had endured. Children played safely near the oak, unaware of the battles once waged beneath its branches. And I understood that what had begun as a personal conflict had transformed into a community lesson, a demonstration of how diligence and honesty could prevent chaos from claiming what is rightfully ours. Karen and I collaborated quietly to reinforce weak spots in the boundary, plant new grass along the cleared drainage, and ensure the fence remains strong through future storms. The work was practical, but each action symbolized reconciliation, a tangible proof that mistakes could lead to understanding if met with patience rather than reaction. By sunset, the yard felt whole. The survey stakes glinted in the fading light, the fence held firm, and the oak tree cast long shadows across the land, steady as ever. I took a final walk along the boundary, reflecting on the journey, the threat of claims, the survey, the tension, and finally, the resolution. Karen stood nearby, respectful and silent, a living reminder that mistakes are often our greatest teachers when we face them honestly. I smiled, feeling a profound sense of closure. The property was secure, the lessons were learned, and the truth had triumphed quietly, leaving pride behind. And as darkness settled over the ridge, I realized that Karen's biggest mistake had become the catalyst for clarity, collaboration, and peace, the kind that endures far longer than conflict ever could.